The September morning arrived in Cincinnati with that characteristic fog rising from the Ohio River, wrapping the city in a gray mist that seemed like an omen. Pete Mallory walked through the streets of the Over-the-Rhine neighborhood with steps that echoed his inner restlessness. At 42 years old, his graying temples betrayed the last 15 years spent behind the bars of Mansfield State Penitentiary. The cold autumn air cut across his face as he observed how everything had changed. The historic Victorian buildings that once housed working families now displayed renovated facades, transformed into elegant cafes and art galleries. Cincinnati had reinvented itself while Pete withered in a cell, convicted of a crime he never committed. "Are you going to be okay?" Sarah Martinez's voice, his post-conviction defense attorney, brought him back to the present. She walked beside him, her worn leather briefcase full of documents representing years of tireless work. "I don't know what okay means anymore, Sarah," Pete replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I spent 15 years saying I was innocent. 15 years. And nobody believed me, not even my own mother in her final days." Sarah stopped at a traffic light on the corner of Vine Street and Central Avenue. The morning traffic followed its chaotic rhythm, indifferent to the drama unfolding on the sidewalk. The woman in her mid-30s adjusted her glasses and looked directly into Pete's eyes with an intensity that had become familiar over the past 3 years of their legal battle. "Today is different, Pete. Today we have something we never had before. A witness. A real witness who was there that night." Pete felt his heart accelerate. The night of March 14, 2010, was etched in his memory like a scar that refused to fade. He had been working his shift at the Great American Ballpark, the Cincinnati Reds stadium, as a maintenance supervisor. It was a cold night, unusually cold for mid-March, and the stadium was empty, silent as a cathedral after a Sunday game. That was the night Martin Drescher, a 67-year-old security guard, was found dead in one of the stadium's storage rooms. A single blow to the head with a metal pipe. The investigation had been quick, almost suspiciously quick. Pete had been the last person seen near the crime scene. He had blood on his uniform, Drescher's blood, as DNA tests would later confirm. And he had a motive, or so the prosecution argued. A heated argument 2 weeks earlier about maintenance schedules. "Who is this witness, Sarah? You haven't told me anything concrete." They crossed the street and continued toward the Hamilton County Courthouse, an imposing limestone building that dominated the downtown landscape. Its neoclassical columns rose like silent sentinels of justice, a justice that had failed Pete 15 years ago. His name is Thomas Wayne Bishop. He's 58 years old now. He worked as a night janitor at the stadium back then, but he was never called to testify. The police never even interviewed him properly. Why not? Pete's frustration was palpable. How is it possible that someone who was there wasn't interviewed? That's what we're going to find out today. Bishop came forward 6 months ago after seeing a documentary about wrongful convictions. He said he's been living with guilt all these years, but he was afraid of retaliation, afraid no one would believe him. They climbed the courthouse steps, each step feeling heavier than the last. Pete could feel the stares of people passing by, some curious, others judgmental. In a city like Cincinnati, where everyone knew everyone, his case had been notorious. The newspapers had called him the Stadium Killer, a sensationalist label that had stuck like tar. Inside, the courthouse maintained its austere elegance. The marble floors reflected the morning light filtering through the tall windows. The echo of footsteps and muffled conversations created a constant murmur, like distant waves. Sarah guided Pete through the familiar corridors to Courtroom 3B, where Judge Margaret Foster would preside over the hearing. "Remember what we talked about," Sarah said, stopping before the heavy wooden doors. "Stay calm, no matter what happens in there. Foster is known for being tough but fair. If Bishop's testimony is credible, she'll listen." Pete nodded, but his hands trembled slightly. 15 years of hope crushed repeatedly had taught him not to expect miracles. He had seen men in prison cling to appeals that never materialized, to lawyers who eventually abandoned their cases, to families who stopped visiting. He had promised himself he wouldn't become one of those broken men, but some days it had been impossible not to feel the weight of despair. The courtroom was already filling up. Pete recognized some faces, journalists who had covered his trial, curious onlookers, and in the back row, his younger sister Jennifer. She was the only family member who had never stopped believing in him, who had visited him every month without fail, who had written letters when words failed during visits. Jennifer's eyes met his, and Pete saw tears already forming. She smiled through them, a smile that tried to convey strength and hope. Pete returned the gesture, though his own heart felt like it might shatter into 1,000 pieces. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Margaret Foster," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom fell into a respectful silence. Judge Foster entered with the authority of someone who had spent 30 years on the bench. She was a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had a reputation for being meticulous, for reading every document, for asking the questions that others overlooked. "Please be seated," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "We are here today for a post-conviction relief hearing in the matter of State of Ohio versus Peter James Mallory. Ms. Martinez, I've reviewed your motion and the supporting documents. This is highly unusual." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah stood, her voice steady and professional. "We are presenting new evidence that was not available at the time of trial. Specifically, eyewitness testimony from Mr. Thomas Wayne Bishop, who was present at Great American Ball Park on the night of March 14, 2010. The assistant district attorney, a young man named Derek Simmons, who hadn't even been out of law school when Pete was convicted, stood up. "Your Honor, the state objects to this hearing. Mr. Mallory was convicted by a jury of his peers based on overwhelming physical evidence. This is simply another attempt to relitigate a closed case." "I'll decide what this is, Mr. Simmons," Judge Foster said coolly. "Ms. Martinez, call your witness." The courtroom doors opened, and Thomas Wayne Bishop entered. He was a thin man with weathered features, dressed in a simple gray suit that looked uncomfortable on his frame. His hands shook slightly as he made his way to the witness stand, and Pete could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the courtroom. After being sworn in, Bishop sat down, his eyes darting nervously around the room before finally settling on Judge Foster. "Mr. Bishop," Sarah began, approaching the witness stand with measured steps, "can you tell us where you were on the night of March 14, 2010? Bishop cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was working at Great American Ball Park. I was a night janitor there." "Speak up, please," Judge Foster instructed. "The court reporter needs to hear you." Bishop nodded and raised his voice. "I was working at the stadium. It was my shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. "And did you see Mr. Mallory that night?" "Yes, ma'am. I saw Pete around midnight. He was in the main corridor near the storage rooms, like he always was during his rounds." "Did you see anyone else?" Bishop's face paled, and he gripped the edge of the witness stand. The courtroom was so silent that Pete could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Yes, I saw two men arguing with Martin Drescher in the loading dock area. It was around 11:30, maybe 11:45. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Foster banged her gavel once. "Order." Sarah continued, her voice carefully controlled. "Can you describe these men?" One was tall, maybe 6'2" or 6'3", with a shaved head. He was wearing a dark jacket like a windbreaker. The other was shorter, stockier, with a beard. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it looked heated. Drescher was shaking his head, and the tall one got right in his face. "Why didn't you come forward with this information 15 years ago?" Bishop's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was scared." The tall one. I recognized him. His name was Victor Reese. He was connected to some bad people in Cincinnati, people you didn't cross. I had a family, 2 kids in school. I convinced myself it wasn't my business, that the police would figure it out without me. But they didn't figure it out, did they? Sarah's voice was gentle but pointed. Instead, an innocent man went to prison. Objection. Simmons was on his feet, leading the witness and argumentative. Sustained, Judge Foster said. Miss Martinez, stick to the facts. Sarah nodded. Mr. Bishop, what made you decide to come forward now? My daughter, Bishop said, his voice breaking. She's studying criminal justice at the University of Cincinnati. Last year, she did a project on wrongful convictions, and she showed me a documentary that featured Pete's case. When I saw his face, heard him talking about how he'd maintained his innocence all these years, I couldn't sleep anymore. I couldn't look my daughter in the eye knowing I let an innocent man rot in prison because I was a coward. Pete felt tears streaming down his face. 15 years of anger, of resentment, of grief. It all came rushing out in that moment. Sarah glanced back at him, and he saw her own eyes glistening. Mr. Bishop, what happened after you saw these men arguing with Mr. Drescher? I went to clean the concession area on the upper level. I was up there for about 30-40 minutes. When I came back down, I saw the same 2 men leaving through the service exit. The tall one, Victor Reese, was wiping something on his jacket. They were walking fast, almost running. And Mr. Drescher? I didn't see him. I assumed he'd finished his rounds and gone to the security office. It wasn't until the next morning that I heard what happened. Did you see Mr. Mallory during this time? No, ma'am. After I saw him around midnight in the corridor, I didn't see him again until the police came and started questioning everyone. Sarah walked back to her table and picked up a photograph. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit A. She approached Bishop. Mr. Bishop, do you recognize the man in this photograph? Bishop looked at the photo and nodded vigorously. That's him. That's Victor Reese, the tall man I saw arguing with Mr. Drescher. Dai, let the record show that Defense Exhibit A is a booking photo of Victor Reese taken in 2012 for armed robbery. Your Honor, Victor Reese is currently serving a 15-year sentence at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. We have submitted a motion to depose him regarding the events of March 14, 2010. Simmons stood again. Your Honor, this is speculation and hearsay. Mr. Bishop's testimony doesn't prove anything except that he saw someone arguing with the victim hours before the murder. Mr. Mallory's blood and DNA were found at the scene. That evidence hasn't changed. The blood evidence was explained at trial, Sarah countered. Mr. Mallory helped Mr. Drescher move some heavy equipment earlier that evening. Mr. Drescher had a cut on his hand that bled on Mr. Mallory's uniform. What the prosecution never explained was why there was no other physical evidence linking Mr. Mallory to the actual murder. No fingerprints on the murder weapon, no motive that made sense, no history of violence. Judge Foster leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Mr. Simmons, has the state made any attempt to investigate Mr. Bishop's claims regarding Victor Reese? Simmons shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, we only learned of these allegations 6 months ago. We've been reviewing the original case files, but Victor Reese has refused to be interviewed. Of course he has, Sarah said, because he's guilty and he knows it. That's enough, Ms. Martinez, Judge Foster said sharply. This is a hearing, not a closing argument. She paused, studying the documents before her. I'm going to order a full investigation into Mr. Bishop's testimony. I want Victor Reese brought before this court, and I want the original physical evidence re-examined with current forensic technology. Mr. Mallory will remain free on his own recognizance pending the outcome of this investigation. Pete's breath caught in his throat. Free. The word seemed impossible, surreal. "Your Honor," Simmons protested, "the defendant was convicted of murder. He's a flight risk. He's been free for 3 months already, since his release on parole, Mr. Simmons, and he hasn't gone anywhere. I don't believe Mr. Mallory is a flight risk. He's waited 15 years for justice." "I think he can wait a few more months," she banged her gavel. "This hearing is adjourned. We'll reconvene in 60 days. As the courtroom erupted in conversation, Pete sat frozen in his chair. Sarah turned to him, a smile breaking across her face. "We did it, Pete. This is it. This is the break we needed." Jennifer rushed forward from the back row, embracing her brother tightly. "I knew it. I always knew the truth would come out." But Pete couldn't celebrate. Not yet. He had learned in prison that hope was the most dangerous thing a man could carry. It could sustain you, but it could also destroy you when it was inevitably crushed. "We're not done yet," he said quietly. "Reese has to talk. And even if he does, what if Foster doesn't believe him? What if—" "Stop," Sarah said firmly. "One step at a time. Today was a victory. Let yourself feel that." As they left the courtroom, Pete noticed an older man standing by the doors, watching him intently. The man had white hair and wore a Reds baseball cap, faded and worn. Their eyes met, and Pete felt a strange jolt of recognition, though he couldn't place where he'd seen the man before. The man approached slowly, and Pete could see that his eyes were wet with tears. "Mr. Mallory," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My name is Charles Drescher. Martin Drescher was my brother." Pete's blood ran cold, the victim's brother. "Here, now." "I just wanted to tell you," Charles continued, "that I never believed you killed Marty. I tried to tell the police, tried to tell the prosecutor, but nobody would listen. Marty talked about you, said you were a good man, a hard worker. He would never have turned his back on you, never let his guard down. But these men Bishop described, Marty had mentioned them to me a week before he died. Said they were pressuring him about something, trying to get him to look the other way during night shifts." "Do you know what they wanted?" Sarah asked immediately, her legal mind already working. Charles shook his head. "Marty wouldn't give me details. He said it was better if I didn't know, that he was going to handle it. But I think maybe they were using the stadium for something illegal. Moving drugs, maybe, or stolen goods. Marty was going to report them, and they killed him for it." "Mr. Drescher," Sarah said gently, "would you be willing to testify about this conversation?" "Absolutely. I've been waiting 15 years to tell someone who would actually listen." As they stood in the courthouse corridor, a shaft of late morning sunlight broke through the clouds outside, streaming through the tall windows and illuminating the marble floor. Pete looked at that light, golden, warm, real, and for the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally set him free. The night air was crisp as Pete stood outside Great American Ballpark 3 days after the hearing. The stadium loomed before him like a sleeping giant, its modern architecture a stark contrast to the historic neighborhoods surrounding it. Sarah had arranged for them to meet Detective Maria Gonzalez here, a young investigator from the Cincinnati Police Department who had been assigned to review the case following Judge Foster's order. "You didn't have to come here," Sarah said, noting the tension in Pete's shoulders. "I could have done this alone." "No," Pete replied, his voice firm. "I've spent 15 years trying to forget this place, trying to forget that night. If we're going to prove my innocence, I need to face it. I need to remember everything." The stadium had been his workplace for 3 years before that fatal night. He'd taken pride in his job, in keeping the facility running smoothly for the thousands of fans who came to watch the Reds play. Baseball had been in Cincinnati's blood since 1869, when the Red Stockings became the first professional baseball team. Working at Great American Ballpark had felt like being part of that history. Now, it was the place where his life had ended. Detective Gonzalez arrived precisely at 8 p.m., as planned. She was a woman in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a CPD windbreaker. Her no-nonsense demeanor reminded Pete of the few honest cops he'd encountered during his original investigation, the ones who had seemed uncertain about the evidence, but had been overruled by their superiors, eager to close the case quickly. "Mr. Mallory, Ms. Martinez," she greeted them with a firm handshake. "I appreciate you meeting me here. I've spent the last 3 days reviewing the original case files, and I have to say there are some significant gaps in the investigation." "That's putting it mildly," Sarah said dryly. Gonzalez pulled out a tablet and opened a digital file. "Thomas Bishop's testimony has opened up several lines of inquiry that were never pursued. Victor Reese, the man Bishop identified, has an extensive criminal history. In 2010, he was known to police as an enforcer for the Carmichael organization, a mid-level criminal enterprise operating out of Newport, Kentucky, just across the river." "The Carmichaels," Pete said, recognition dawning. "I remember hearing about them. Weren't they involved in drug trafficking?" "Among other things," Gonzalez confirmed. "Smuggling, racketeering, money laundering. They were investigated multiple times but were very good at insulating their leadership. Most of their foot soldiers, like Reese, kept their mouths shut. The organization largely fell apart in 2013 when the FBI finally managed to build a RICO case against the top brass." "So what was Reese doing at the stadium that night?" Sarah asked. "That's what we need to figure out. I pulled the security logs from March 2010. Interestingly, there was a pattern of after-hours deliveries to the stadium's loading dock on nights when Martin Drescher wasn't the primary security guard. But on March 14th, the regular guard called in sick and Drescher took the shift." Pete felt pieces beginning to click into place. Marty was meticulous about his job. If he saw something suspicious, he would have investigated. And that would have put him directly in conflict with whatever operation Reese was running, Gonzalez concluded. "The question is, can we prove it 15 years later?" She led them to the service entrance on the west side of the stadium. A young security guard, informed of their visit, unlocked the gate and let them through. The familiar corridors brought a flood of memories rushing back to Pete. The smell of concrete and industrial cleaner, the echo of footsteps, the distant hum of machinery that never quite stopped even when the stadium was empty. "The body was found here," Gonzalez said, stopping at a storage room door. "According to the original crime scene photos, Drescher was lying face down just inside. The murder weapon, a metal pipe, was found 3 feet away. It had been wiped clean of fingerprints. If Pete had killed him in a moment of rage, as the prosecution claimed, why would he have wiped the weapon clean?" Sarah asked. "That suggests premeditation, which contradicts their theory." "The prosecution argued both ways," Pete said bitterly. "I was smart enough to wipe the weapon, but stupid enough to leave my bloody uniform at the scene. Their theory never made sense." Gonzalez nodded. "I noticed that contradiction in the files. There's also the matter of the surveillance cameras. In 2010, the stadium had a fairly comprehensive system, but the footage from that night was conveniently corrupted." "Corrupted how?" Sarah's interest was piqued. "According to the report, there was a power surge that wiped several hours of footage. But here's the interesting part. The surge only affected cameras in specific areas. The main concourses, the parking lots, the executive offices, all of those cameras worked fine, but the loading dock, the service corridors, and this storage area, all corrupted." "That's not a coincidence," Pete said. "No, it's not. And here's something else. I spoke with the IT technician who serviced the security system back then. He's retired now, living in Columbus. He told me that the system was designed with multiple redundancies, specifically to prevent that kind of data loss. For it to happen would require someone with physical access to the server room and knowledge of the system. Sarah pulled out her notepad. Do we know who had that access? According to the records, about 15 people had key card access to the IT areas. Martin Drescher was one of them as head of night security. Pete Mallory was another as maintenance supervisor. But there were also several outside contractors who did regular service work on the stadium systems. Contractors who might have connections to the Carmichaels, Sarah asked. I'm pulling those records now. It's going to take some time. A lot of these companies are defunct and their employees have scattered. But if we can place someone connected to Reese in that server room on the night of March 14th, we might have our smoking gun. They continued walking through the corridors, retracing Pete's movements from that night. He had started his shift at 10 p.m., the same as always. His routine had been predictable: check the HVAC systems, inspect the plumbing in the restrooms, ensure that all doors and locks were functioning properly. It was solitary work, which he'd actually enjoyed. After dealing with crowds during game days, the quiet nights had been a kind of meditation. I saw Marty around 10:30, Pete recalled, his voice distant as he walked through the memory. He was doing his rounds by the main entrance. We talked for a few minutes about the upcoming season, about whether the Reds had a shot at the playoffs. He seemed normal, relaxed. There was no tension between us, despite what the prosecution claimed about our argument 2 weeks earlier. Tell me about that argument, Gonzalez said. Pete sighed. It was nothing, really. Marty wanted me to adjust my maintenance schedule because it conflicted with some new security protocols he was implementing. I thought his timeline was unrealistic and we had words about it, but we worked it out the next day. We grabbed lunch together, for God's sake. We were colleagues, friendly colleagues. But the prosecution painted it as a grudge match, Sarah added. They found 2 other employees who testified that tensions were high between you and Drescher. Those employees were lying, Pete said flatly, or they were pressured. I never understood why they said those things. Gonzalez made a note on her tablet. I'll re-interview them if they're still around. Sometimes people feel differently about their testimony after 15 years, especially if they were coerced or misled. They reached the loading dock, a cavernous space with high ceilings and large bay doors that could accommodate delivery trucks. In 2010, this area had been used for everything from food service deliveries to equipment shipments. It was also isolated from the main stadium, making it an ideal location for illicit activity. Thomas Bishop said he saw Reese and another man arguing with Drescher around 11:30, somewhere in this area, Gonzalez said, scanning the space. If they were using this dock for smuggling operations, Drescher would have been the perfect person to either facilitate or expose them. Marty would never facilitate crime, Pete said with certainty. He was straight as an arrow. Ex-military, believed in doing things by the book, which means he would have threatened to expose them, Sarah concluded. And that sealed his fate. A sound from the upper level made them all look up. It was just the wind rattling a loose panel, but it reminded Pete of how vulnerable and isolated this place felt at night. Marty had died here, alone, surrounded by concrete and shadows. No one had heard him cry out. No one had come to help. I've arranged for Victor Reese to be transported from Chillicothe tomorrow, Gonzalez said. Judge Foster's order compels him to answer questions. He can't hide behind the Fifth Amendment because he's already been convicted of another crime. If he refuses to cooperate, she can hold him in contempt. Do you think he'll talk? Pete asked. I think he's 58 years old and looking at another decade in prison. The Carmichael organization is long gone. There's no one to retaliate against him anymore. His kids have grown up without him. He might be ready to clear his conscience, especially if we can offer him something in return. Like what? Sarah asked sharply. We're not making deals with a murderer. I'm not suggesting we let him walk free, Gonzalez clarified. But if he gives us information that leads to others involved in Drescher's death or the smuggling operation, The prosecutor might be willing to recommend prison transfers to a facility closer to his family, better conditions, things like that. Small concessions that might be enough to loosen his tongue. As they prepared to leave the stadium, Pete took one last look around the loading dock. Somewhere in this cold, empty space, Martin Drescher had taken his last breath, struck down by men who valued their criminal enterprise more than human life. And Pete had paid the price for their crime, losing 15 years of his life, his mother's final years, his reputation, his freedom. "We're going to make this right," Sarah said quietly, sensing his anguish. "I promise you, Pete, we're going to make this right." I didn't, but as they walked out into the Cincinnati night, the stadium lights casting long shadows across the pavement, Pete couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Victor Reese might talk, or he might stay silent. The evidence might finally vindicate Pete, or it might remain frustratingly incomplete. Justice was not guaranteed, even for the innocent. The city stretched out before them, the lights of downtown Cincinnati reflecting off the Ohio River. Somewhere in this city, someone knew the truth about what had happened that night. Someone had helped Victor Reese cover up his crime. Someone had been content to let Pete Mallory take the fall. And somehow, they were going to find that person. The Hamilton County Justice Center was a fortress of concrete and steel, housing both the county jail and the courthouse complex. Pete had spent 6 months here after his arrest, before being transferred to Mansfield. The memories of that time, the strip searches, the dehumanizing intake process, the terror of not knowing what was happening, came rushing back as he passed through the security checkpoint with Sarah and Detective Gonzalez. "You okay?" Sarah asked, noticing how pale he'd become. "Just memories," Pete said through gritted teeth. "I'll be fine." They were there to observe Victor Reese's interview, which would take place in one of the interrogation rooms. Judge Foster had granted Sarah's motion to be present, though Pete would watch from an adjacent observation room through a one-way mirror. Gonzalez had partnered with Detective James Wilson, a veteran investigator who had worked organized crime cases throughout the 2000s and knew the Carmichael organization intimately. Victor Reese was brought in wearing orange jail scrubs, his hands cuffed in front of him. The tall, imposing man Thomas Bishop had described was now significantly aged, his shaved head now completely white, his face deeply lined, his body showing the toll of years in prison. But his eyes were still sharp, calculating, assessing everyone in the room as potential threats or opportunities. Wilson started the recorder and read the date and time for the record. "Mr. Reese, you've been brought here pursuant to a court order in the matter of State of Ohio versus Peter Mallory. You understand that you're required to answer questions about the events of March 14th, 2010. Reese's voice was gravelly from years of smoking. "I understand. Doesn't mean I remember anything useful. That was 15 years ago." "You were at Great American Ballpark that night," Gonzalez said. "It wasn't a question." "According to who?" "According to a witness who saw you there. A witness who saw you arguing with Martin Drescher approximately 30 minutes before he was murdered." Reese's expression didn't change, but Pete, watching from the other room, noticed his hands tighten slightly. "Attell." "I don't recall being at any stadium," Reese said carefully. Wilson leaned forward. "Victor, let me be straight with you. The Carmichael organization is gone. Tommy Carmichael died of cancer in federal prison 3 years ago. His brother Frank is serving life without parole. Joey Russo, your old partner, flipped in 2013 and is in witness protection. There's nobody left to be loyal to, nobody to protect you or threaten you. I got nothing to say about the Carmichaels." "We're not asking about the Carmichaels specifically," Gonzalez said. "We're asking about Martin Drescher. We know you were running smuggling operations through the stadium. We know Drescher discovered what you were doing and threatened to report you. We know you killed him to keep him quiet. You know a lot of things that ain't true," Reese shot back. You got no evidence. We have eyewitness testimony. One guy who claims he saw me 15 years ago? That's not evidence, that's desperation. Sarah, standing beside Pete in the observation room, muttered under her breath. He's not going to give us anything. He's been in the system too long. He knows how to play this game. There has to be something we can use, Pete said. Some leverage. As if reading their thoughts, Wilson changed tactics. How old are your kids now, Victor? Danny must be, 28? And Sarah's 25? Reese's jaw tightened. You leave my kids out of this. I'm not threatening them, Victor. I'm asking about them because I know you haven't seen them in 13 years. Not since 2012 when you were convicted of armed robbery. Your ex-wife moved them to Colorado, got remarried, tried to give them a normal life away from your shadow. What's your point? My point is that you're 58 years old. Even with good behavior, you're not getting out until 2027. You'll be 60. Your kids will be in their 30s, probably with families of their own, kids who don't even know you exist. And then what? You spend your remaining years in some halfway house, alone, cut off from everyone who ever mattered to you. That's the life I chose, Reese said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. But it doesn't have to be, Gonzalez said softly. Victor, a man has been in prison for 15 years for something you did. An innocent man. He lost his mother, his career, his life. Don't you think that's enough? Don't you think one innocent person suffering for your crimes is enough? I didn't kill Drescher, Reese said suddenly. His voice was different now, not defiant but tired. I was there that night. I'm not going to lie about that. But I didn't kill him. The observation room fell silent. Sarah gripped Pete's arm. Then who did? Wilson asked. Reese was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle playing out across his face. Finally, he spoke. If I tell you, I need guarantees, real guarantees. What kind of guarantees? I want a transfer to a federal facility closer to Colorado. I want protection, real protection, not just some promise that disappears as soon as I talk. And I want my testimony to be considered for a sentence reduction. Wilson and Gonzalez exchanged glances. We can't make those promises right now, Gonzalez said, but we can talk to the U.S. Attorney's Office. If your information leads to solving a 15-year-old murder and exonerating an innocent man, they'll be motivated to work with you. I need something in writing before I say anything else. That's going to take time, Wilson said. Days, maybe weeks to negotiate. Then I'll wait, Reese said, leaning back in his chair. I've gotten good at waiting. Back in the observation room, Pete felt his hope deflating. He's playing games. Even now, after everything, he's playing games. He's protecting himself, Sarah said. In his world, information is currency. He won't spend it without knowing what he's getting in return. Detective Gonzalez emerged from the interrogation room, frustration evident on her face. We're going to have to loop in the prosecutor's office and probably the U.S. attorney. This is going to take time. How much time? Pete demanded. Another week, another month, another 15 years? I know this is frustrating, but we have to do this right. If we push too hard and Reese decides to clam up completely, we're back to square one. Over the next week, Pete lived in a state of agonizing limbo. Sarah worked tirelessly with prosecutors and federal authorities to hammer out an agreement with Reese. Meanwhile, Detective Gonzalez continued her investigation, tracking down former stadium employees, reviewing old security protocols, and building a comprehensive picture of the smuggling operation that had likely been running through Great American Ballpark in 2010. She discovered that the Carmichaels had used the stadium as a distribution point for prescription opioids smuggled from corrupt pharmacies in Kentucky and Ohio. The drugs would arrive hidden in legitimate deliveries, be temporarily stored in the stadium's vast network of storage rooms, and then be distributed to dealers throughout the Cincinnati metro area. It was an elegant operation. The stadium's regular deliveries provided perfect cover, and the nighttime security was minimal enough to be easily compromised. Martin Drescher's military background and strict adherence to protocol had made him a liability. According to Gonzalez's research, Drescher had filed an internal report just 2 days before his death, noting suspicious activity during late-night deliveries. The report had never made it to stadium management. It had disappeared from the system entirely. Someone with access to the administrative database deleted it, Gonzalez explained during a meeting at Sarah's office in downtown Cincinnati. The office was modest, located in a converted brownstone on 4th Street, with law books lining the walls and case files stacked on every available surface. I found fragments in the backup archives, but the original was purged the day after Drescher's murder. Who had that level of access? Sarah asked, making notes on her legal pad. According to IT records, about 20 people, stadium administrators, senior security personnel, and several contracted IT service providers. I'm cross-referencing those names with known associates of the Carmichael organization, but it's slow going. Many of these people have moved, changed jobs, or passed away. Pete sat in the corner of the office, listening but feeling increasingly helpless. He was a piece in this puzzle, but he couldn't actively contribute to solving it. His entire future depended on other people, investigators, prosecutors, judges, and the waiting was excruciating. Jennifer visited him almost daily at the small apartment Sarah had helped him rent in the North Side neighborhood. She brought groceries, helped him navigate the overwhelming changes in technology and daily life that had occurred during his incarceration, and most importantly, provided companionship that reminded him he wasn't alone. "You seem different lately," Jennifer observed one evening as they shared dinner. Simple pasta that Pete had cooked, one of the few skills he'd maintained from his previous life. More withdrawn. "I thought getting out would feel like freedom," Pete admitted. "But it's just a different kind of prison. I can't work. Who's going to hire a guy with a murder conviction? I can't move on with my life because everything is still in limbo. I'm stuck between guilt and innocence, between prisoner and free man." "You're innocent, Pete. The truth is coming out." "Is it?" "Reese has been negotiating for a week and we're no closer to hearing what he has to say. Judge Foster reconvenes the hearing in 3 weeks. What if we don't have anything new by then? What if she decides Bishop's testimony isn't enough?" Jennifer reached across the table and gripped his hand. "Then we keep fighting. For another week, another month, another 15 years if we have to. But I don't think it will come to that. I can feel it, Pete. Something's breaking loose." She was right, though neither of them knew it at the time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Detective Wilson received a call from Joey Russo, the former Carmichael associate who had entered witness protection in 2013. Russo had heard through former criminal contacts that Victor Reese was talking to police about the Drescher murder, and he wanted to add his voice to the conversation. Russo was the logistics guy for the Carmichael's opioid operation, Wilson explained to Pete, Sarah, and Gonzalez during an emergency meeting at the Justice Center. He coordinated the deliveries, maintained the network of corrupt doctors and pharmacists, and kept the books. If anyone knows what happened at that stadium, it's him. "Why is he coming forward now?" Sarah asked suspiciously. "What does he gain? Peace of mind, maybe? Or maybe he's heard that Reese is cutting a deal and wants to protect his own immunity agreement. Either way, he's willing to give a full statement about the stadium operation and what happened to Martin Drescher." The statement, when it came, was damning. Rousseau confirmed that the Carmichaels had been using Great American Ballpark as a drug distribution hub throughout 2009 and 2010. Victor Reese had been the primary enforcer, responsible for ensuring that security guards and other stadium employees looked the other way during late-night operations. Martin Drescher had been the exception, an incorruptible obstacle who had figured out what was happening and threatened to expose everything. On March 14, 2010, Rees and another enforcer named Marcus Webb had confronted Drescher at the loading dock, attempting to bribe him into silence. When Drescher refused and threatened to call the police, Webb had struck him with a metal pipe taken from a nearby maintenance cart. Webb panicked, Russo's statement read. He hit Drescher harder than intended, killed him instantly. Rees took control of the situation. They wiped down the pipe, repositioned the body to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but they needed a fall guy, someone to take the heat off the organization. Pete Mallory had been the perfect patsy. He'd been in the stadium that night, had blood on his uniform from helping Drescher earlier in the evening, and had no alibi for the specific time of the murder. The corrupt IT contractor, a man named Leonard Pike, who had connections to the Carmichaels, had deleted the surveillance footage and Drescher's internal report. The police, under pressure to solve a high-profile murder quickly, had focused on the obvious suspect and ignored evidence that didn't fit their narrative. "Where is Marcus Webb now?" Sarah demanded after reading Russo's statement. "Dead," Wilson said grimly. "Killed in a dispute with a rival drug crew in 2014, but we have Leonard Pike. He's living in Dayton, working as an IT consultant. Gonzalez and I are bringing him in for questioning today." Leonard Pike turned out to be the weak link they needed. Faced with potential charges for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and accessory to murder, the 52-year-old former contractor broke down almost immediately. He confirmed everything Russo had said, adding details about how he'd been paid $15,000 to delete the surveillance footage and Drescher's report. "I didn't know they were going to kill anyone," Pike said through tears during his interview. "I thought it was just about letting some shipments through, looking the other way. When I heard Drescher was dead, I was terrified, but by then, I was in too deep. Rees told me that if I said anything, I'd be next." With Pike's confession, combined with Russo's statement and Bishop's eyewitness testimony, the case against Pete Mallory collapsed like a house of cards. Sarah immediately filed an emergency motion for exoneration, and Judge Foster scheduled a hearing for the following week, 2 weeks earlier than originally planned. The night before the hearing, Pete couldn't sleep. He walked the streets of Cincinnati until dawn, watching the city wake up. Delivery trucks made their rounds, early commuters headed to work, restaurant owners prepared for the day ahead. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. He ended up at the Purple People Bridge, a pedestrian bridge spanning the Ohio River between Cincinnati and Newport, Kentucky. The sunrise painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, reflecting off the water below. Cincinnati's skyline rose behind him, familiar yet somehow new. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Ready for today?" Pete typed back, "As ready as I'll ever be." But that wasn't quite true. How could anyone be ready for this moment, the moment when 15 years of injustice might finally be acknowledged, when the truth might finally overpower the lie that had destroyed his life? As he walked back toward downtown, toward the courthouse where his fate would be decided one final time, Pete thought about Martin Drescher, an honest man who had paid with his life for refusing to compromise his principles. Pete's exoneration wouldn't bring Drescher back, wouldn't undo his murder, but it would honor his memory by ensuring that his death wasn't compounded by an innocent man's suffering. The streets of Cincinnati had never looked so beautiful. The courtroom was packed. News of the new evidence had spread throughout Cincinnati, and reporters from every major news outlet in Ohio filled the gallery. Pete recognized faces from 15 years ago, journalists who had covered his trial, who had written stories portraying him as a cold-blooded killer. Now they were here to witness his potential exoneration. Jennifer sat in the front row, along with several members of Pete's extended family who had distanced themselves after his conviction but were now cautiously returning. Charles Drescher, Martin's brother, sat nearby, his weathered face a mixture of grief and vindication. Thomas Bishop sat in the back, looking uncomfortable with the attention his testimony had generated. His daughter, a young woman in her mid-20s, sat beside him holding his hand. She had been the catalyst for his coming forward, and Pete made a mental note to thank her if he got the chance. Judge Foster entered, and the courtroom rose. She looked tired, Pete thought. The weight of this case, of knowing an innocent man had spent 15 years in prison because of a failed justice system, showed in the lines around her eyes. "Please be seated," she said, her voice grave. "This is a continuation of the post-conviction relief hearing in the matter of State of Ohio versus Peter James Mallory. I have reviewed all the new evidence presented over the past 2 weeks, including the testimonies of Thomas Bishop and Leonard Pike, the statement from Joseph Russo, and the reports from Detective Gonzalez and Detective Wilson regarding their investigation into the Carmichael organization's activities." She paused, organizing the documents before her with meticulous care. The courtroom was so silent that Pete could hear the wall clock ticking, each second stretching into eternity. "I have also reviewed the original trial transcripts and evidence with fresh eyes, looking for what was missed, ignored, or deliberately obscured. What I have found is deeply disturbing, not just as a judge, but as a citizen of this community and as someone who has dedicated her life to the pursuit of justice." Assistant District Attorney Simmons sat at the prosecution table, looking uncomfortable. He had not been involved in the original prosecution, but he represented the state now, and the state's failure was evident. "The evidence presented in this hearing demonstrates, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Mr. Mallory was wrongfully convicted of Martin Drescher's murder. The actual killers were Victor Reese and Marcus Webb, who murdered Mr. Drescher to protect a drug smuggling operation run by the Carmichael criminal organization. This operation was facilitated by corrupt security practices at Great American Ballpark and by the deliberate tampering with evidence by Leonard Pike." Judge Foster's voice grew harder. "Furthermore, the original investigation was deeply flawed. Evidence that contradicted the prosecution's theory was ignored. Witness testimony was cherry-picked to support a narrative of guilt. And most damningly, exculpatory evidence, including Martin Drescher's own internal report about suspicious activities, was either overlooked or deliberately suppressed." Pete felt his heart pounding so hard, he thought it might burst through his chest. Sarah gripped his hand under the table. "The question before this court is not whether Mr. Mallory deserves a new trial. The evidence makes clear that no reasonable jury, properly presented with all the facts, could convict him of this crime. The question is whether the state should be forced to admit its catastrophic failure and provide appropriate compensation for the years Mr. Mallory has lost." Judge Foster looked directly at Simmons. "Mr. Simmons, does the state have any objection to the immediate exoneration of Peter James Mallory?" Simmons stood slowly. "No, Your Honor. The state has reviewed all the evidence and concurs that Mr. Mallory's conviction should be vacated immediately." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Foster banged her gavel once for order. "Mr. Mallory, please stand." Pete rose on shaky legs, Sarah standing beside him. "Mr. Mallory, it is the finding of this court that you are factually innocent of all charges related to the murder of Martin Drescher. Your conviction is hereby vacated, and all related charges are dismissed with prejudice. You are a free man, with all rights restored." The gavel came down with finality. For a moment, Pete couldn't process what he'd heard. Free, innocent, exonerated. The words seemed to float in the air, refusing to land in his consciousness. Then Jennifer was there, wrapping her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "You're free, Pete. You're really free." The courtroom erupted in applause. Reporters rushed toward the doors to file their stories. Sarah was hugging him too, and he realized he was crying. Great, heaving sobs that he'd held inside for 15 years. "Mr. Mallory," Judge Foster's voice cut through the chaos. "Would you approach the bench, please?" Pete walked forward on unsteady legs. Up close, he could see that Judge Foster's eyes were wet with tears she was fighting to contain. "Mr. Mallory, I want you to know that I am filing a formal complaint with the Ohio Judicial Conference regarding the handling of your original trial. The failures in your case represent a systemic problem that goes beyond any individual prosecutor or investigator. You deserved better from this system. Martin Drescher deserved better. I can't give you back the years you lost, but I can promise you that I will do everything in my power to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "Thank you, Your Honor," Pete managed to say. "That means more than you know. I'm also recommending that you file a civil rights lawsuit against the state and the city of Cincinnati. You are entitled to compensation for wrongful imprisonment, and I will personally testify about the failures in your case if necessary." Outside the courthouse, a mob of reporters waited. Pete stood on the steps with Sarah and Jennifer, facing the cameras and microphones thrust in his direction. The autumn sun was bright, almost blindingly so after the dim courtroom. "Mr. Mallory, how does it feel to be exonerated? Are you angry at the justice system? What are you going to do now? Will you sue the state?" The questions came rapid fire, overwhelming. Sarah held up her hand for quiet. "Mr. Mallory will give a brief statement," she said. "He will not be taking questions at this time." Pete looked out at the crowd, reporters, supporters, curious onlookers. He saw Thomas Bishop standing at the back, and their eyes met. Pete nodded his thanks, and Bishop nodded back, tears running down his weathered face. 15 years ago, I was convicted of a crime I didn't commit," Pete began, his voice hoarse but growing stronger. "I lost my mother, my career, my freedom, and my reputation. I was locked in a cage for something I didn't do while the real killers walked free." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I'm angry. I'm devastated by all the time I lost. But I'm also grateful. Grateful to Thomas Bishop for having the courage to come forward after all these years. Grateful to Sarah Martinez for believing in me when no one else would. Grateful to Detectives Gonzalez and Wilson for pursuing the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. And grateful to Judge Foster for having the integrity to admit that the system failed." His voice cracked. Martin Drescher was a good man who died trying to do the right thing. His death was compounded by my wrongful conviction. I can't bring him back, but I can honor his memory by living my life with the same integrity he showed. I'm going to rebuild, I'm going to heal, and I'm going to fight to make sure this doesn't happen to others. He stepped back from the microphones, exhausted. Sarah fielded a few more questions, while Jennifer guided him toward a waiting car. As they drove away from the courthouse, Pete watched the city pass by, his city, where he'd been born, raised, wrongfully imprisoned, and finally vindicated. Cincinnati had changed in 15 years, but it was still home. "Where do you want to go?" Jennifer asked. "Your apartment, my house, anywhere you want." Pete thought for a moment. "The cemetery. I want to visit Mom." They drove to Spring Grove Cemetery, one of the largest and most beautiful cemeteries in the country, with rolling hills and ancient trees. Pete's mother, Margaret Mallory, had been buried here 3 years ago. Pete had been denied permission to attend the funeral. One more cruelty in a long line of them. He stood before her grave, simple granite with her name and dates. Margaret Ann Mallory, 1948-2022, beloved mother and teacher. "Hi, Mom," Pete said softly. "I'm sorry I couldn't be here when you needed me. I'm sorry you died thinking your son was a murderer, but I need you to know I was innocent. Everyone knows it now. The truth came out, just like you always said it would." Jennifer stood a respectful distance away, giving him privacy. "I'm going to be okay," Pete continued. "I don't know what my life looks like now, but I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to make you proud. I promise." A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Pete closed his eyes and, for the first time in 15 years, felt something close to peace. 2 months after his exoneration, Pete stood outside Great American Ballpark once again. But this time was different. This time he wasn't there as a suspect or a victim, but as a guest. The Cincinnati Reds organization had reached out through Sarah, offering both a public apology for the role their inadequate security protocols had played in his wrongful conviction and an invitation to throw out the ceremonial first pitch at a special ceremony in his honor. Pete had been reluctant at first. The stadium still carried painful memories, but Charles Drescher had called him personally, asking him to accept. "Marty loved this place," Charles had said. "He loved baseball, loved being part of the Reds' history. Honoring you here would honor him too. It would show that truth and justice can prevail, even in the place where so much went wrong." So here Pete stood on a crisp November evening, with Jennifer beside him and Sarah just a few steps behind. The stands were filling up for what would be one of the last games of the season. The Reds hadn't made the playoffs, but attendance was strong. Cincinnati loved its baseball team with a loyalty that transcended wins and losses. In the 2 months since his exoneration, Pete's life had begun to slowly rebuild. The state of Ohio had offered a preliminary settlement of $1.5 million in compensation for his wrongful imprisonment, approximately $100,000 for each year he'd lost. Sarah was negotiating for significantly more, but even that initial offer had allowed Pete to secure stable housing and begin planning for the future. He'd given numerous interviews, his story picked up by national media. 60 Minutes had done a segment on his case. The Innocence Project had invited him to speak at their annual conference. But mostly, Pete had spent time learning to simply be free, walking where he wanted, eating what he wanted, sleeping when he wanted, without bars or guards or schedules dictated by others. Detective Gonzalez approached them near the player's entrance. "Mr. Mallory, they're ready for you in about 15 minutes. How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Pete admitted. "I haven't been on a pitcher's mound since high school." "It's just ceremonial," Gonzalez said with a smile. "They don't expect a fastball." Over the past weeks, Gonzalez had become something of a friend. Her thorough investigation had been instrumental in his exoneration, and she'd continued to work on unraveling the full extent of the Carmichael organization's operations. Leonard Pike had been charged with obstruction of justice and was cooperating with federal authorities. Victor Reese, in exchange for his testimony against Pike and others, had received a transfer to a facility in Colorado and a modest sentence reduction. "There's someone who wants to meet you," Gonzalez said, gesturing to a figure standing in the shadows near the dugout. As the person stepped forward, Pete's breath caught. It was an elderly man in his 70s, wearing a vintage Cincinnati Reds jacket and cap. His weathered face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Mr. Mallory," the man said, extending his hand, "my name is Pete Rose." Pete Mallory stood frozen. Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle, the all-time hits leader, a Cincinnati legend. Despite his permanent ban from baseball for gambling, they shared the same first name. But Rose had spent his life chasing baseball immortality, while Pete Mallory had spent 15 years fighting for basic justice. "Mr. Rose," Pete managed, shaking the offered hand. I don't know what to say." "Call me Pete," Rose said with a slight smile. "Gets confusing otherwise, two Petes standing here." "Why are you here?" Pete asked. Rose's expression grew serious. "Because I know what it's like to be judged, to have your whole life defined by your worst moments or by things people believe you did. I made mistakes, real mistakes that I own. But you didn't do anything wrong, and you paid a price worse than anything I've ever faced." He paused, looking out at the field where he'd played so many historic games. "I've been following your case. When I heard you were coming here tonight, I wanted to be here. I wanted to tell you something that I learned too late in my own life. The truth matters. Speaking the truth, standing up for the truth, it's harder than hitting a curveball, harder than diving headfirst into home plate. But it's what makes us human. I spent 15 years telling the truth, Pete said, emotion welling up. And nobody listened. But Thomas Bishop listened. Eventually people listened. The truth won out, Pete. That doesn't always happen in this world. When it does, it's worth celebrating. Rose reached into his jacket and pulled out a baseball. This is from the game where I got my 4,192nd hit, breaking Ty Cobb's record, September 11th, 1985, right here in Cincinnati. I've held onto this ball for 40 years. I want you to have it. Mr. Rose, I can't. Yes, you can. You're going to throw out the first pitch tonight, and you're going to do it with this ball. Then you're going to keep it as a reminder that Cincinnati believes in second chances, that this city believes in justice, that we don't forget our own, and we sure as hell don't abandon innocent people. Pete took the baseball, feeling its weight in his hand. The leather was worn smooth, the stitches slightly frayed. It was a piece of history, and Rose was entrusting it to him. "Thank you," Pete whispered. "This means more than I can say." Rose nodded and stepped back. "Make it a good throw, Pete. The city's watching." As Rose disappeared into the stadium's corridors, Sarah approached, tears in her eyes. "Did that really just happen?" "I think so," Pete said, still staring at the baseball. "I'm not entirely sure this whole day is real." A stadium official came to escort Pete to the field. As they walked through the tunnel toward the diamond, Pete could hear the growing roar of the crowd. His hands were shaking, his heart racing. Then they emerged into the lights. Great American Ballpark spread before him in all its glory. The manicured grass, the red dirt of the infield, the towering lights illuminating everything like a stage. The scoreboard showed his face, and the words, "Pete Mallory, exonerated and free." The crowd erupted in applause. 35,000 people on their feet cheering for him. Pete felt tears streaming down his face as he walked toward the pitcher's mound. He could see fans holding signs. "Justice for Pete. Welcome home. Truth wins." The Reds' current manager met him at the mound, shaking his hand. "Take your time," he said. "Enjoy this moment." Pete stood on the mound, Pete Rose's historic baseball in his hand, and looked around the stadium. Somewhere up there was Jennifer, cheering for her brother. Sarah was there too, probably crying with pride. Thomas Bishop had been invited as a guest of honor, his courage celebrated. Charles Drescher was there, honoring his brother's memory by supporting Pete's vindication. The catcher crouched behind home plate, mitt ready. Pete went through the motions, the wind-up, the delivery, and threw the ball. It wasn't a perfect throw, a little high and outside, but the catcher caught it cleanly. The crowd erupted again. As Pete walked off the mound, he looked up at the stands, at all those faces cheering for him, supporting him, celebrating his freedom. For 15 years he'd been alone in his fight for justice. But he'd never truly been alone. There had always been people who believed, who hoped, who worked for the truth. And now, on this November evening in Cincinnati, with the lights blazing and the crowd roaring, Pete Mallory finally felt what he'd been denied for so long: vindication, recognition, and the sweet possibility of a future free from the shadow of a crime he never committed. Later that night, after the game, Pete stood on the Purple People Bridge again, looking out over the Ohio River. The city lights reflected on the water, creating ribbons of gold and silver. Cincinnati stretched out on both sides of the river, a city that had witnessed his fall and his redemption. His phone buzzed, a text from Jennifer. "You did it, big brother. Mom would be so proud." Another text, this one from Sarah. "The state has agreed to our settlement terms, $3.2 million plus a formal apology from the governor. We won, Pete. We really won." Pete looked down at Pete Rose's baseball, which he'd carried with him from the stadium. He thought about all the people who had made this moment possible: Sarah, who had fought tirelessly for 3 years, Gonzalez and Wilson, who had pursued the truth wherever it led, Thomas Bishop, who had overcome his fear to do the right thing, Judge Foster, who had the integrity to admit the system's failures, Charles Drescher, who had never believed Pete was guilty, Jennifer, who had never stopped visiting, never stopped believing. And he thought about Martin Drescher, a good man who had died because he refused to compromise his principles. Pete's exoneration couldn't bring Martin back, but it could ensure that his death hadn't been compounded by an additional injustice. "I'm going to make it count, Marty," Pete said quietly to the night. "Every day of freedom, every opportunity I have, I'm going to make it count." A couple walked past him on the bridge, hand in hand, laughing about something. They didn't recognize him, didn't know his story. To them, he was just another person enjoying the Cincinnati night. And that anonymity, that normalcy, it was perhaps the greatest gift of all. Pete Mallory, at 42 years old, had been given something rare and precious, a second chance. Not everyone who suffered wrongful conviction received exoneration. Not everyone got to stand on a pitcher's mound and hear thousands cheer their name. Not everyone got to hold a piece of baseball history given to them by a legend who understood what it meant to fall from grace and seek redemption. He was one of the lucky ones, Pete realized, and he wasn't going to waste it. As he walked back toward his apartment in Northside, past the late-night restaurants and bars, past the historic buildings and modern developments, Pete thought about the future. He didn't know exactly what it would hold. Maybe he'd write a book about his experience. Maybe he'd work with the Innocence Project to help others wrongfully convicted. Maybe he'd simply live quietly and rediscover all the small joys that had been stolen from him. What he did know was this: he was free, he was innocent, he was vindicated. And after 15 years in the silent courtroom of public judgment, Pete Rose, the baseball legend, had spoken words that mattered more than any jury verdict. The truth matters. And finally, after all those years, the truth had set Pete Mallory free.